Welcome to Simply Their Story. This is the story of Daniel told by a famous wine merchant, Erdebana. It's taken from Daniel chapters 1 to 6.
My name is Erdebana. I am a noblewoman in the Persian courts. I'm also a wine merchant. I run vast wine estates based on palm trees. This estate has been handed down through my family. In the Babylonian Empire, women are encouraged to own businesses, particularly those of wine merchants and grain merchants, and I'm very blessed to have both. My family business supplies the king's palace. We supply his tables with wine from our dates. We supply his kitchens with date sugar and date flour. And we supply his builders with our bark, which they make into rope, and the trunks of the palms that they use to build with. So I'm fairly important in the Babylonian Empire. But today, this is not my story. Today, I want to share with you a story of men of God who walked in an unbelieving world, trusting God for protection and receiving it. I want to tell you a story that shows God to be mightier than any empire, bigger than any kingdom, and He chooses kings at His discretion, not ours. Babylon is a very beautiful city. It's built on the Euphrates River. And at the time of my story, it begins with King Nabopolassar. King Nabopolassar took a tiny kingdom and he began to conquer the nations around it, building the city of Babylon into a kingdom, and then his son built it into the empire known today as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The empire was grand and gracious. His son Nebuchadnezzar took this empire and turned it into something incredible, the strongest, biggest empire to the known world. A wealthy empire. An empire not just from our place alone, but King Nebuchadnezzar turned it into a kingdom that reigned with total authority from the Persian Gulf right through to the Egyptian frontier. But King Nebuchadnezzar was not just a warmonger. He also was a city builder, and he built Babylon up on its ruined foundations into a great city. He built huge palaces, 3 just for himself. He built incredible fortified walls around our city. There were 3 rings of them, so thick that the soldiers used to race their chariots along these walls, kicking up dust clouds as they gambled on the walls. To show the incredible wealth and splendor of our land, in a desert where water is more valuable than gold, he built a moat all the way around our city and filled it with precious, life-giving water. He was a great king, and it was a privilege to serve in his palace. My father was a general in his army, and he can remember the times when Nabopolassar had started the rebuilding of the city. And he was so proud to serve King Nebuchadnezzar. Our family is very noble. We can date our family line all the way back to the great king, the Amorite King Hammurabi, who described the code of Hammurabi, which is a very intricate legal code still used in Babylon today, and one day used in your world too. One of the great things that King Nebuchadnezzar built was the Gate of Ishtar, for which it was famous throughout the world. I remember being a teenager when we had the first parades go through the gates. I stood with my family, my heart filled with pride. The gate was huge, with huge archways. It sparkled gold and blue in the sun. They had tiled in mosaics, intricate designs all the way through the entrance, and this was the main road that led to the main palace in the city of Babylon. They used lapis lazuli, which is a really valuable commodity, and gold. So this gate wasn't just a security gate into the city. It was a political statement. It was a statement of power, a statement of wealth, and a statement of majesty. Inscribed along the gates in these mosaics were pictures of our gods of Babylon. Some of them in human form, some of them as horse-like creatures and dog-like creatures. And around them all, there was various blooming flowers showing the fertility of Babylon. And over and above these were the lions, the depiction of the might and majesty of King Nebuchadnezzar the Great. And the people who really are important in the story enter the story now. My father remembers going through to Judah. They had had a puppet king, but now were in revolt against Babylon. And they were sent to wipe out the king, ransack the temple of their God Yahweh, bringing back the sacred vessels and the best of their nobility to Babylon. For King Nebuchadnezzar had a very clever policy. He brought the brightest and the best from every conquered nation to build his empire and win loyalty. So in this trip, my father told me there were 3,000 exiles being brought home. He said they were herded like sheep, broken, discouraged, shattered by their defeat. Because the defeat of Judah meant the end of the Israel-Judah kingdom that had lasted for more than 400 years under the protection of their God. And now, because their kings had not honored Yahweh, they had lost everything. And it was to King Nebuchadnezzar's court that these people were brought. And there were 4 young men, just teenagers, about 18 years old, who stood before the king and were selected for his training program to work in the palace, to become part of the new empire. Now these 4 young men were way below my notice. I was noble. I was about the same age, but I was training to work with my mother. And I remember being in the palace, discussing business, and it did get a bit tedious listening to them talk of contracts and prices. When I heard these 4 young men from Judah very politely refusing to eat the food that the king had sent for them. That caught my attention. Who refuses wine and meat and grain when it's given to them? I expected the palace official to give them a don't be ridiculous. You're lucky to be fed at all. But he didn't. Strangely, he listened to them. And then he agreed that for 2 weeks, 10 days to 14 days, they could eat what they wanted, which was vegetables and drink water. And if they were still healthy, they would be allowed to continue. My curiosity was aroused, so I slipped from my mother's side and I went to speak to them. And the young man, Daniel, said to me that they didn't eat meat that had been offered to idols, which was true of all the food that came through the palace. Why not? There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's the best of the best because it's good enough for the gods. And he said, no, it would dishonor their God, Yahweh. They served only the one true God. He said they also didn't eat some of the meats, again, in deference to Yahweh. I said, okay, you're weird. But I left them. And I must say, there was a spark of interest. There was something about the integrity of standing in a foreign court making demands about your diet in honor of your God. I wondered how long would it last? They were young men away from their country, away from their sacred temple, away from their parents. Would they really continue? My mother then called my name and I raced back to my duties. And I left those young men to start learning about the intricacies of Babylon. They were to learn about astrology. They were to learn about the divination of dreams. And on the training program, the very first thing that the trainers did was to change their names. The name's important. The name defines who you are. And in Judah, a name was often associated with their religion and their God. So they changed all 4 names. Daniel's name meant God is my judge. They changed it to Belshazzar. His friends, Hananiah, his name meant God is gracious. Mishael's name meant he belonged to God. And Azariah, his name meant Jehovah helps. So they changed their names to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All good Babylonian names, honoring King Nebuchadnezzar and honoring our gods. They had no choice, they had to accept. I went about my duties, and about 2 weeks later I was back in the palace with messages from my mother, and I was curious to see, were these young men still eating their vegetables? Or had they succumbed and accepted a glass of wine? No, they hadn't. And I have to admit, they were looking better than the others on the team who were eating the idol's food and were drinking the king's wine. And so the palace officials had said that they could continue. I was happy for them, that was good. And I thought little more about them, until a few months passed, and when we were in the palace kitchens, we heard the rumours. King Nebuchadnezzar was troubled by a dream. It was a dream so vivid he would wake up in a cold sweat at night. It was a dream so strongly impacting on his psyche he couldn't think of anything else in the day. Now, in Babylonian culture, dreams are very important. We believed that dreams are a communication from the gods to us here on earth. And Babylon was famous for both its astrology and its book of dreams and divination. King could find no answer in any of the books. So he called on the Magi. The Magi were the team of the wisest men from the empire. They were sorcerers, astrologers, dream diviners, the magicians. None of them were able to help the king, because when the king called them all to the third palace and they stood in the southern room, he stood on his dais and he said, "This dream is troubling me beyond measure." But now the king knew that the Magi would say whatever was in their best interest. So he decided that if they truly knew the answer to the dream, they would know the dream itself. So in front of all the Magi, he said, "I've had this troubling dream. I need you to tell me what the dream is, and then give me the interpretation. What does it mean?" The Magi gasped. How can one person know another person's dream? We don't even understand each other's dreams, never mind be able to see inside your head. The Magi said, "But Your Majesty, this is impossible. No man can do this. If you tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation, but we can't tell you the dream itself." You never, ever give an absolute no to an arrogant king. And the king was furious. He decreed that if they could not tell him his dream and what it meant, he would have every sorcerer, astrologer, and dream diviner put to death. And that included the trainees. So that included Daniel and his friends. There was silence in the courtroom. How would our empire function without any sorcerers? How would we know what the gods wanted if there was no one to tell us? And then Daniel walked into the room. He'd been told by one of the officials what the king had decreed, and he stood in his simple second-year uniform, a simple white robe, no jewels, no embellishment, his young face innocent and pure, and he asked for audience with the king. He asked the king if he could have some time, he would be able to give them the dream and the interpretation thereof. He just needed one night. Unbelievably, this angry king said yes. I think there was a bit of desperation in him to know, and already Daniel had been marked out as having a special gift with dreams. But still, he was only a second-year student. The wisest and greatest in the land couldn't help. What was he thinking? And so when he left the room, I raced after him, and as he walked to find his friends, I walked with him. "Daniel, what are you thinking? You know, you're only going to win yourself one night, and after that night, the death is just going to be more gruesome because the king will be more angry." You know, his pace was unhurried. In his face calm, there was an assurance and a confidence. And he smiled at me. He said, "Onobama, my God is the God of mysteries. Nothing is impossible for my God. He left me to find his friends, and later it was said through the palace that none of those 4 men slept that night. They were on their knees before Yahweh asking for help. And in the morning, the courtroom was filled. There wasn't breathing room. Every magi, sorcerer, prince, and magistrate was in the room to find out what was going to happen now. And when Daniel walked in, a murmur went up. People cleared away so he could walk to the king. And as he stood waiting for an audience, slowly silence descended upon the room. And with the king's permission, into that silence, Daniel began to speak. His voice was calm. There was no arrogance in his stance. He started by giving glory to God, his God, Yahweh, the one true God. And he told the king that the king had dreamt of a great statue, a huge, magnificent statue whose head was pure gold. Its body was made up of silver. Its thighs were made up of iron. Its belly was made of bronze and its thighs of iron. Its feet were of iron and clay. You could see on the king's face that Daniel was right. And then Daniel said God had brought this dream to the king to enable him to know what was coming. And he said that through God's wisdom, this is what the dream meant. That the head of gold represented King Nebuchadnezzar, who'd been given so much power and authority by God to rule a great empire. After his empire, there would be a series of 4 more empires that followed, each one of less value as indicated by the metals. The 3rd empire, being the empire of iron, would be a very strong empire and it would crush all others that had come before it. The feet of clay and iron represented a divided kingdom. And after this divided kingdom, God would raise up a kingdom that would last forever under his own rule. And in the silence of the room, Daniel finished. And he said, I haven't been given this because I am wiser or cleverer or more talented. God has given this because you, my king, need to know the future. The king was in awe. In front of that crowded room, of all the greats of the land, he fell before Daniel and proclaimed that Yahweh is truly the God of mysteries, the God of kings. And then we watched as he called for gifts to rain down on Daniel for telling him what the dream meant. On Daniel's request, he called for his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he gave them administrative positions in the province, elevating them to officials. He made Daniel head of the Magi and kept him close in the royal courts. The nobility left in silence. Never had we ever seen this arrogant king prostrate himself to anything before. The change in the Magi would not affect us much, but it did affect them. They left with their throats intact, their pride in tatters. For now, these young men who weren't even qualified would be in charge over them. The very ability that Daniel's God had shown only showed up the inadequacy of their own skill and the patheticness of their own gods. And they were not grateful. They were angry. They were humiliated. And into the fertile soil of their hearts, jealousy and hatred were sown. The young men all proved to be very honourable. They were all blessed. God moved on their lives, and they worked well. They worked with integrity and honour and honesty, which did not make them popular in a court run on corruption and political intrigue. Daniel and I became friends because he was close and high up in the palace, and he proved himself to be such a man of integrity, putting God first in everything. never letting our culture touch his core belief in Yahweh and Yahweh's goodness. He was away on business, and the men in the courts, the jealousy grew more and more as his three friends grew more and more powerful and trusted by the king. They couldn't find fault with their work. They couldn't catch them out in dishonesty to report to the king. So they decided the only way that they could harm these men was through their trust and honor of Yahweh. And so they schemed together, and they went to the king, and they preyed on his arrogance and vanity. And with their encouragement, the king called for the building of a great statue. This statue was 28 meters high. It was 3 meters wide and magnificent. It was to be put up on a pedestal on the plains of Dura, just inside the city wall. And the king was encouraged to call for all nobility, all the sorcerers, all the governors, the magistrates and officials to come to the plains of Dura. And there they would dedicate the statue, and they would bow down in abject worship as a sign of worship to King Nebuchadnezzar as God. I was just so glad Daniel was away, because I knew there's no ways he would do it. I didn't mind. I was Babylonian. What's one more statue to bow to? My gods weren't particularly jealous. They didn't do much, so one day of festival sounded fun to me. Because the nobility too had been summoned to the plains of Dura. And it was an amazing day. There were dancers, and as they came through, you could see the dust clouds puff up under their feet. Their veils were every colour imaginable as they danced towards the statue. It was festive, there was music. And then the king stepped forward himself, and he said that at the sound of the wind instruments, the string instruments would play. And once the string instruments had played, all other instruments were to join in, and every person from every tribe and every nation was to bow before the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. The crowd went silent as he finished. Anyone who fails to do so will be put to death in the fiery furnaces. I glanced around at the crowd, and I could see Daniel's friend standing not far away from me. And I could see that same look of resolve as when they refused to eat the meat of idols was on their faces. Tried to catch their eye, waved at them, and I jumped up and down. They didn't look at me. Wanted to say to them, the king's not joking. If you don't obey, you're going to die. This is a trap set just for you. You could always just worship Yahweh when you bend down. No one needs to know what's going on inside your head. Just do it, because the king will be really angry. But they didn't glance my way. Their eyes were fixed on heaven, and they looked nowhere else. And then the musical instruments began, and it became exciting as everything got louder and louder, and with a final trumpet blow, the entire mass of people bent down and worshipped. No, I'm wrong. It was not the entire crowd. For there, standing amongst the officials, stood Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, eyes raised to heaven, knees unbent, chins high. And I thought, well, maybe there's a lot of dust and noise and confusion that the king won't notice. Those young men had enemies who made sure the king noticed, and the king was angry. He shouted for them, "Come forward, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. No God will save you from my wrath. Why do you not bow?" There's not a sound. So those 3 men stood before every important member of that entire kingdom. We waited. Surely they could make up an excuse. And then I couldn't see which one, but one of them spoke up. And he said, "King, we have no excuse. Our God can save us. But even if he should not, we will not bow before your statue, and we will not worship you as God. We would rather burn in the fire." The king, quite predictably, flew into a royal rage. He was beyond angry. He called for the furnaces to be heated 7 times hotter than normal. His strongest soldiers came forward and bundled the men up. They tied them with thick cords and carried them towards the furnace. The furnace was by now so hot that as the men walked in and put these 3 captives down, they died before they could leave the furnace. And the king watched from a distance, his face angry and red. And then the blood drained from his face as he jumped up. There weren't 3 men in the fire. There weren't 3 charred bodies. There were 4 men walking around. 4, not 3, walking, not bound and burnt. How could this be? The king himself ran closer towards the furnace. Perspiration glistened on his brow as he raised his arm to shield his face from the heat. And he called out, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, your God is mighty, come forth. Your God is supreme." And out of the furnace walked those 3 young men. We stepped back, allowing them to walk through to get to the king. Our amazement complete. There was not a singed hair. There was not a scorch mark on their clothes. They didn't even smell like smoke. And right there and then, on a day that was meant to honor the king himself as God, the king himself said, no one was to ever disrespect Yahweh, the God of Judah, who rescued his people, sent an angel to protect them from the heat of the fiery furnace. What irony. What a great and majestic God. We don't always like his timing, but I think there's a certain majesty in it. And there and then, the king gave them further promotion for their integrity and honor. And for those evil men who plotted and schemed and worked so hard for their downfall, they won nothing. But the men of God came out even better after the trial by fire. God is good. And time passed. Kings come and go. And eventually, King Nebuchadnezzar had another dream. And once again, the Magi could not help. The books of dreams had no answers. And I was down south on business at one of my palm estates when a message went out that we received as nobility. A message from the king to say that Yahweh was the supreme God, the almighty God, the King of kings and Lord of lords, and he was above every king of every nation. Because King Nebuchadnezzar had had another dream. This dream he could not understand, and once again the king said, only Daniel's God could give him the interpretation of the dream. Right there and then I left. I raced back up to the palace to speak to the officials. What had happened? What was the story? King Nebuchadnezzar had dreamt of a tree, a great tree, a beautiful tree. It was filled with leaves, and off every bough hung masses of wonderful, healthy fruit. And then an angel had appeared and cut the tree down. It had bound the stump in iron. And he'd heard the words that this man will be left for 7 years in the wild. He had no idea what it meant. But Daniel, through God's grace and wisdom, was able to tell him. And the dream had meant, Daniel said, that the tree represented King Nebuchadnezzar himself. That he was a great king, and he provided food and shelter for so many. But because of his arrogance, his desire to be better than all the rest, because of his pride, he would be cut down. And for 7 years, he would become insane and wander in the wilds. The stump that remained was to show that once he acknowledged God as the one true God, mightier and more majestic than him, he would return as king. And Daniel had begged him. He had said, please put God first. Honor God in all you do. Be fair to the poor. Do what is right. Avoid this fate. And for a while the king did. But as often happens, his resolve slipped and life got busy. And a year later, the king stood on the roof of his palace and he looked out over his beautiful city. He was dressed in his most resplendent robes, gems sparkled in his beard, his crown rested on his brow. And he looked at his city. He looked at the sunlight glowing off the walls. He looked at the glistening water bringing life to the palm estates all the way around. And his heart filled with pride, and he said, this is all for my glory. This is all because of me. This is my majesty. His attendants said, no sooner were those words out of his mouth than a voice came from heaven and said, for your arrogance you will be stripped of your mind, and you will wander in the wild for 7 years. And no sooner were the words out than it happened. The king lost his mind. His insanity was so violent that he had to be driven from the palace. And he slept in the wild. He ate grass like an ox. He slept on the ground where the dew fell on him each night. His hair grew as long as bird feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. The kingdom continued to operate because of the administrators. And because of Daniel's words, no new king was appointed. And for 7 years, the king wandered in the wilds. For 7 years, his insanity ruled. And then one day, this bedraggled, filthy, dirty, long-haired man arrived at the gates of Ishtar and claimed to be king. The soldiers would have turned him away, but one of the senior commanders recognized the king's voice and called for the officials from the palace who came. When they knew it was the king, they raced him up to the palace, where he groomed himself, he donned his royal robes, and then went into the court to make a proclamation. The king said that he had looked up and his insanity was gone, and he recognized that God is the God of everything. God is bigger than any empire, any kingdom, and kings come and go at the pleasure of God alone. From that time on, the king continued to rule his country. He ruled in a total for 43 years. And from then on, there weren't so many banquets. There was no pride in the king because he worshipped God, as did many in the courts who followed him, including my family and myself. And Daniel continued to serve the king too, until his death when he was in his 70s. By now, Daniel and I were getting on too, we were in our late 50s, but we continued to serve King Nebuchadnezzar's son. And a few decades passed. Kings do come and go. And now, we had an awful king. We had a vile king. His lifestyle was debauched. He had no integrity. The empire was disintegrating under his careless rule, and he cared nothing but for himself and his own pleasure. I hardly attended court these days. I pleaded age, but it wasn't that. I didn't want to be part of this new kingdom. I was still in the palace because we still served the king, and Daniel still served the king. And I'll never forget the night that I was called in. The king had called for a banquet, nothing unusual. They'd run out of wine, not unusual. So they'd called for me to bring the best and place it in the banquet hall, which I was busy doing, trying desperately not to see the conduct of the people around me. I had glanced up and seen that they had taken the sacred vessels taken from the temple of Yahweh, and they were drinking wine from them like they were common cups. I felt sick to my stomach. What disrespect! Why? My duties were finished and I was hurrying to leave the room when a gasp went across the entire banquet hall. A horror! I looked round to see what was happening. and out of nowhere had appeared a hand. And this hand was writing across the wall words we couldn't even read. No one knew what they meant. The king sent for Daniel to come and interpret the words for him. He was trembling in fear. Nothing like fear to sober up a revelry. Daniel arrived, calm as usual, and he read the words, Mene, Mene, Tekel Upshakin. Your kingdom has been judged. The days are numbered, and it will be given to the Medes and the Persians. Suddenly what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar came back to everyone's mind, and the king trembled. The room was filled with fear and doom, and I hurried away. And God's prophecy came true that very night. Darius of the Medes arrived. He stormed the temple. He killed the king. And he established his own rule, absorbing Babylon into the Persian Empire. And Daniel's prophecy from all those years ago when he was a young man was coming true. The empire of Babylon, the golden head, had fallen, and it was now time for the Persians, silver torso in arms. When Darius arrived, he established a very fair community. He set up 120 princes with 3 presidents. The head president was responsible for taking care of the king's affairs. He would collect the taxes from the waterways. He collected the money from the estates. And it had to be someone of integrity and honor and experience. And God favored Daniel, and Darius chose him to be first president in the land. Darius was a fair king. He was a kind man. He even allowed the people to continue worshipping their own gods, including Yahweh. But once again, Daniel worked with integrity and honor, and the princes beneath him and the presidents beneath him didn't like that. There was no room for corruption. There was no room for self-gain. There was no room for promotion with Daniel above him. And they watched him, and they plotted and schemed, but they could find no flaw in his work or his life. There was nothing they could bring to the king to bring Daniel down, because he was a man of God. But they could use that fact against him. He was a man of God. He would only worship Yahweh. Darius didn't know the history of these people, these stubborn Judeans. And so these men plotted. They went before the king, appealing to his vanity, and said, for 30 days, pass a decree that you alone can be worshipped. No other god may be worshipped in that time. Darius thought it was quite a nice way of bonding the empire, so he passed a decree. And that decree was based on the Code of Hammurabi, which said that once a king has passed a decree, it cannot be revoked, not even by the king himself. As soon as I heard, I went to speak to Daniel. I said, what are you going to do? He said, same as usual. I will pray to Yahweh 3 times a day because he is my God. And following him is more important than following Darius's decree. I didn't argue because by now I knew Daniel well enough not to bother. And Daniel went to his room 3 times a day. And with his window open towards Jerusalem, he prayed to Yahweh. No subterfuge, no attempt to hide his loyalty to God. And of course, that's all these men wanted, and they raced to the king. And they told him, he's broken your decree. Darius was devastated. He loved Daniel. He appreciated Daniel's honor and integrity, and now he himself, king, couldn't save him. Daniel was in his 80s, walking next to the king as the king said, I hope your God can save you, I hope your God can save you, because I'm really sorry this wasn't what I had planned. I didn't know this would happen. Now the lions that they used were kept for the sport of kings. They were kept in a big pit, and the kings would hunt them. So there was a viewing platform from above, and a big one entrance gate that Daniel was pushed through. It was said that the king paced all night. He did not sleep, thinking with horror of what would happen to his friend, his confidant, his administrator. And the next morning I was already at the viewing wall when the king arrived himself, looking dishevelled. And he ran up and he stood on the viewing deck and he shouted down, "Daniel, has your God saved you?" And together with the morning sun rose the smell of lions. And Daniel's voice, as calm as if he was in the courtroom itself. "My God has saved me, Your Majesty. He has shut the lions' mouths. They have not harmed me, because I am innocent in His sight, and I've done nothing wrong in your sight either." The king was so relieved he couldn't even wait for the gates to be opened. He got the soldiers to throw a rope down and haul Daniel up with themselves, as if he couldn't wait to set eyes on his friend. And as Daniel came up, we saw it wasn't a scratch on his skin. There wasn't a mark on his coat. God had truly saved him. Darius was so relieved that he called for the men who'd created this problem to all be brought in. And now that the gate was open, they and their family were pushed into the lion's den, and the lions devoured them all. And King Darius said from that day that no one was to ever dishonor Yahweh. He was the true God, a mighty God, a savior of his people. And from that day, Daniel continued to serve the empire, and he continued to have dreams and visions. And he left behind a legacy that none of us can ever forget. That in a culture of unbelief, we have a God who is mighty and majestic. In a culture of distrust and corruption, we have a God who protects his people and guides them. And from this story, which is taken from the book of Daniel, chapters 1 to 6, we learn that God is a mighty God, and he holds you in his hand, and he will do so, always, because we are his people. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you will go and read up on it in chapters 1 to 6 and see how no matter how ungodly the society, God's people can always prevail.